cold Friday afternoon in December 1995, a chilling event unfolded that would haunt a small Ohio community for decades. The Markley family's 5 children returned home from school to find their house in disarray, and their parents, John and Shelley Markley, mysteriously missing. There were no notes, no phone calls, and no signs indicating where they had gone or when they would return. The only clues left behind were strange and unsettling details that suggested something was terribly wrong. Inside the house, it was clear that this wasn't just a case of the Markleys stepping out for a while. The safes and locked cabinets were found wide open, their contents gone. The coffee pot, which was always turned off after use, was still running, nearly empty and left unattended. Most troubling of all, the tarps that always covered John's prized Corvette were gone, as though someone had planned to take it. These were not the actions of a couple simply deciding to step away for a moment. Something far more sinister seemed to have occurred. What made their disappearance even more troubling was that it wasn't just any ordinary Friday. This was the 8th birthday of their youngest child, Johnny. In the evening, the family had planned to attend a wake for John's beloved twin sister, who had passed away just days before. John and Shelley were incredibly close-knit, and family meant everything to them. The idea that they would miss such important events, especially on such a deeply emotional day, was unthinkable. As the hours passed, the situation grew increasingly concerning. The family waited for John and Shelley to return, but as the night wore on and they failed to show up, panic began to set in. Family members started to suspect that something had happened to the couple. The absence of any form of communication, combined with the chaotic state of the house, raised serious doubts. Were they victims of a random crime, or was something more personal and perhaps darker at play? The following day, family members reported John and Shelley missing. It had been more than 12 hours since they were last seen, and their failure to attend the wake for John's twin sister made it even more apparent that something was terribly wrong. Many people in the family could not believe that John, who had been so close to his sister, would simply abandon everything during such a trying time. Some thought he might have needed time to grieve, but the overwhelming feeling was that something had gone awry. Investigators were immediately called to the scene. The case quickly spiraled into confusion as they were faced with a crime scene that had been compromised by well-meaning but misguided family members. Despite their best intentions to preserve some semblance of order, the evidence had been inadvertently tampered with. The house had been cleaned, the coffee pot emptied, and other signs of disturbance that could have pointed to clues had been erased. As a result, the investigators were left with very little to work with, making it difficult to piece together the truth of what had happened. One of the most puzzling aspects of the case was the involvement of an unknown third party. According to reports from the bank, the last known transaction for the couple took place earlier that morning. John and Shelley had arrived at the local bank, where Shelley wrote a $1,000 check for cash. The bank teller noted that John was in the driver's seat of their red and silver Chevy pickup, with Shelley sitting between him and an unidentified man. This man, a dark-haired individual with a slender build, was not recognized by the teller and remained a mystery. As the investigation unfolded, the mystery deepened. Were John and Shelley the victims of a crime of opportunity, or had they been specifically targeted by someone they knew? Was the mysterious man in the bank involved in their disappearance, or was he merely an innocent bystander? The unknown man would come to symbolize the questions that would remain unanswered for years. John Markley and Shelley Applequist had been a loving couple, deeply committed to their 5 children. After the tragic fire in 1993 that destroyed their previous home, they had worked hard to rebuild their lives. The Markleys had settled into a quiet, rural home in West Farmington, Ohio, where they found peace after the devastation. Despite some financial struggles, including John's back injury that kept him from working as a truck driver, they remained focused on their family. In the years leading up to their disappearance, John and Shelley had faced a series of personal losses that took a toll on their emotional well-being. John's father passed away in 1994, followed by the death of their nephew. But nothing had prepared them for the heartbreak of losing Bonnie, John's twin sister, just days before their disappearance. Her death was a crushing blow to the family, especially to John, who had been so close to her. On December 13th, the grief-stricken family had said their goodbyes to Bonnie, and arrangements were made for the funeral and wake. Yet, on December 15th, something went terribly wrong. After a morning outing to the bank, John and Shelley vanished without a trace. The Markleys left behind not just their children and a home, but a trail of questions that has yet to be answered. The unsettling details of the case, an open safe, a coffee pot left on, and a missing Corvette, paint a picture of a couple who were taken by force, or at the very least, against their will. As the investigation unfolded, the theories surrounding their disappearance began to grow. Had they been targeted by someone they trusted, or was this the work of an outsider? Nearly 30 years later, the questions remain, and the case of John and Shelley Markley is still one of Ohio's most baffling mysteries. John Markley was a man whose life was deeply intertwined with family. He was born on Wednesday, July 8, 1959, in Valdosta, Lowndes County, Georgia, to parents John and Ruth Markley. The second of 10 children, John was especially close to his twin sister, Bonnie. As a young boy, John's family moved around, but by the time he was 14 in 1973, they settled in Ohio, primarily in Trumbull County. From an early age, John's family instilled in him the importance of loyalty, love, and putting family above all else. These values weren't just something John learned, they were woven into the very fabric of his being, becoming a lifestyle that would guide him throughout his life. John was described by friends and family as a kind-hearted, fun-loving man who always had a smile on his face. His quick wit and easy laugh made him someone people enjoyed being around. But beneath his light-hearted exterior was a man deeply devoted to his family. He cherished his siblings and parents, and that sense of family loyalty would be a driving force in his life, especially when it came to his wife, Shelley, and their children. Shelley Renee Applequist, born on Saturday, November 16, 1963, in Warren, Ohio, was John's soulmate. The daughter of Orrin and Carol Applequist, Shelley grew up as the third of 5 children. She was smart, sweet, and kind, qualities that drew John to her when they met. Friends and family described Shelley as warm, though somewhat shy, with an immense capacity for love. She was incredibly attentive and nurturing, always ready to offer a shoulder to cry on or a hug to comfort someone in need. Her love for family was as deep as John's, and it was clear from the beginning that they were a perfect match. Shelley's devotion to her family, combined with John's, created a foundation for a strong marriage. Their relationship was built on mutual respect, understanding, and an unwavering loyalty to one another. It didn't take long for John and Shelley to realize that they were meant to be together. Within months of meeting, their connection grew into a love so profound that it changed the course of their lives forever. On Friday, November 30th, 1979, John and Shelley were married in a ceremony overseen by Reverend Albert Broadwater of Bristolville. At the time of their wedding, John was 20 years old, and Shelley, just 16, was still a teenager, which meant that her parents had to give consent for the marriage. Despite their young ages, they were already steadfast in their commitment to one another, and this decision would set the course for the rest of their lives. After their marriage, John and Shelley quickly began building their family. They had 5 children in total: 4 daughters, Ruthie, Stacy, Bonnie, and Crystal, and 1 son, Johnny. John, having worked as an oil rig driller and later as an independent truck driver, worked hard to provide for his family. Shelley stayed home, raising their children and creating a warm, loving environment for them. She made sure to take her children grocery shopping each week, corralling all 5 of them to help her with the task, which was a big job considering their rural home was several miles away from the nearest store. John and Shelley's parenting style was deeply influenced by their own upbringings. John, who had been very close to his twin sister, Bonnie, was particularly protective of his daughters. He set strict rules about dating, telling them they couldn't date until they were 16, a rule that stemmed from his own experiences with Shelley, whom he had married when she was just 16. Shelley, too, was protective, But her nurturing side was always on full display as she dedicated herself to the well-being of their children. Despite the many hardships that life threw their way, including the devastating fire in 1993 that destroyed their first home, John and Shelley persevered. They were determined to provide their children with a better life, and they succeeded in doing so. After the fire, they purchased a new home in West Farmington, a rural village in northwest Trumbull County, where they rebuilt their lives. It was a modest home, but it was paid off entirely, a testament to John's hard work and their commitment to their family's future. The house was perfect for the Markleys. Located on a peaceful, sprawling piece of land, it was far enough from the nearest neighbors to provide the privacy and serenity they had been seeking. John and Shelley had worked hard to get there. John had even started his own trucking company, Markley Trucking, which allowed him to work for himself and still be at home with his family. Their financial situation was stable, and John's pride and joy was his beloved 1978 Deep Apple Red Corvette, which he kept in pristine condition, carefully covered with 2 tarps in the garage to protect it from potential damage. However, despite their newfound happiness, 1994 would prove to be a difficult year for the family. That year, John's father, John Markley Sr., passed away at the age of 80, a loss that hit John particularly hard. Before he could fully recover from that grief, a few months later, the family experienced another tragedy when their nephew died after struggling with depression. It was a tough summer, and John and Shelley found themselves reeling from one loss after another. Yet, their bond as a couple remained unshaken. They relied on each other to navigate these challenging times, always knowing that family was their greatest source of strength. By December 1995, John and Shelley had found some sense of normalcy again. Their children were thriving, and the family was looking forward to celebrating the holidays. John and Shelley had made plans for the wake of John's beloved twin sister, Bonnie, who had passed away just days before. It was a devastating loss for John, and the idea that he would miss his twin sister's wake, let alone disappear without a trace, seemed unthinkable to everyone who knew him. But on the morning of December 15, 1995, everything changed. After dropping their youngest child off at the bus stop, John and Shelley were seen together in their red and silver Chevy pickup, accompanied by an unknown man. The bank teller who processed their last transaction described them as being in good spirits. But hours later, when their children arrived home to find the house in disarray and their parents gone, it became clear that something horrific had occurred. The key to understanding what happened to John and Shelley Markley would soon become a question that lingered. Who was the mysterious man in the truck with them that morning, and what role did he play in their disappearance? This question would haunt investigators and their loved ones for years, as it became evident that the Markleys' sudden disappearance was anything but random. The morning of Friday, December 15, 1995, was cold and damp in Trumbull County. At 7:42 a.m., the faintest hint of dawn broke through the thick gray clouds, though much of the early light was obscured by the persistent overcast sky. The temperature hovered just above freezing, with high humidity making the air feel cold and uncomfortable. The weather didn't improve as the day went on. Scattered rain showers fell intermittently, and strong southerly winds pushed through the region, dropping the temperature further. For the Markley household, this was expected to be a difficult day, with stark contrasts of grief and celebration ahead. The family was about to face a strange juxtaposition: the funeral of John's beloved twin sister, Bonnie, just days before, and the celebration of their youngest child, Johnny's 8th birthday. There were only a few details known about the morning's activities in and around the Markley home on Greenville Road. The most significant information came from Johnny, the youngest of the children, who was the last person to see his parents that morning before he went to school. Johnny later told investigators that after he woke up and got ready for school, he went to the kitchen, where Shelley made him a bowl of cereal. After breakfast, they both left the house and walked along Greenville Road to the bus stop, where Shelley waited with him until around 8:30 a.m. when he boarded the school bus. This was the last time anyone in the family saw John or Shelley. Hours passed, and the Markley children returned home to a scene that was anything but normal. They discovered that all 4 doors to the house were closed, but not locked, which was unusual, as the Markleys, living in the rural area, were always very security conscious. They also noticed that the family's red and silver Chevy pickup truck was not parked in the driveway, and there was no sign of John or Shelley. Inside the house, the situation became even more concerning. In the kitchen, the coffee maker was still on, nearly running out of water, a clear sign that someone had started it and left without turning it off. On the kitchen counter was a fake leather cigarette case containing a pack of Marlboro cigarettes and a lighter. Shelley, a heavy smoker, was never the type to forget her cigarettes, not even for a short errand. Additionally, John's watch, which he always wore first thing in the morning, was sitting on the shelf above the counter, a place where he always kept it at the end of the day. A relative later confirmed that John had been seen in the kitchen earlier that morning, still in his pajamas, wearing that very watch before he even had his first cup of coffee. The children then made their way to the garage. There, they immediately noticed that John's cherished 1978 apple red Corvette was still parked in its usual spot. However, the 2 tarps that John always used to cover the car were now missing. According to family and friends, John was obsessive about keeping the car protected from any potential scratches, whether from the kids' bikes or other outdoor items. For the tarps to be missing was not only unusual, but deeply alarming. Back inside the house, the children went upstairs to their parents' bedroom, where they found several disturbing signs of disarray. The gun cabinet, which John kept locked and secure, was found open, with the door ajar. John had been a longtime gun collector and was always cautious about keeping firearms out of reach of the children, so finding the cabinet unlocked was deeply troubling. Further investigation into the bedroom revealed 2 of John's suits on the bed, alongside some of Shelley's more formal clothes, suggesting that they had been planning to attend Bonnie's funeral later that day. But the bed itself was in disarray, and it was later revealed that no beds in the house had been made, something Shelley always took great care in doing. Next, the children entered a small walk-in closet adjacent to the master bedroom, where they found a safe. The safe was open, and a small locked box, typically kept inside it, had been removed. Legal documents, papers, and even birth certificates were scattered around the room, indicating that someone had rummaged through the box, possibly looking for something specific. At this point, the children had no idea what had truly happened. They weren't certain whether something strange had occurred or if their parents had simply stepped out for some errands. Given the emotional toll that Bonnie's death had taken on John, they initially thought that he and Shelley might have gone off for a while to clear their heads, to escape the sorrow they were both dealing with. However, as the hours passed and the time for the wake drew closer, the children began to grow more anxious. They decided to reach out to their aunt and uncle, Judy and Tom Jagger, who lived just a few miles away. Unsure of what was happening, Judy told Ruthie to make some snacks for the kids, reassuring her that she and Tom would be over soon. When they arrived around 4 p.m., they waited for John and Shelley to show up, but when they didn't, the situation became more concerning. At 5:30 p.m., the family decided to leave for the wake, but John and Shelley were still nowhere to be found. After the wake, at around 9 p.m., Judy and Tom brought the children back home to the Greenville Road house. They still found no sign of John or Shelley, and the house was just as empty as before. It was then that, after midnight, Judy and Tom made the decision to report the couple as missing to the Trumbull County Sheriff's Office. The next day, a sheriff's deputy began to search the area for any signs of the Markleys or their vehicle. Around Sunday morning, December 17th, a truck matching the description of John's red and silver Chevy pickup was found in the parking lot of a local hardware store, Stanbus, located at 3850 Elm Road Northeast, about 15 miles southeast of the Markley home. The truck was covered in a thick layer of dirt, indicating it had been driven off-road. There was even a "Wash Me" message written in the dirt on one of the truck doors. Family members confirmed that John and Shelley did not typically take the truck off-road or allow it to become so dirty. The vehicle was locked, and the keys were nowhere to be found. When investigators gained access to the truck, they found very little inside, except for Markley's cell phone, which was discovered on the center console. In the bed of the truck were two tarps, one blue and one green, consistent with the ones John had used to cover his Corvette. Despite a thorough search of the truck, no substantial evidence was found. No fingerprints or unidentified hairs were discovered either. While the discovery of the truck gave investigators a sense of where John and Shelley might have been after their disappearance, it didn't provide any clear answers about what had happened. The search of the hardware store revealed no useful information about when the truck had been parked there or who had been driving it. With no new leads, investigators were left with more questions than answers. Further investigation of the Markley home revealed more troubling signs. Family members had entered the house in the days following the disappearance, caring for the children and cleaning the house. They had unintentionally removed or cleaned away potential evidence, including clothes, papers, and even the coffee maker, making it more difficult for investigators to determine what exactly had transpired. In the days following the disappearance, the realization set in. This was no ordinary case of a missing persons report. Something far darker was unfolding. Despite the lack of evidence, one thing remained clear. There was something deeply wrong about the disappearance of John and Shelley Markley, and it was time for the investigation to turn into something much more serious. As the investigation into the disappearance of John and Shelley Markley continued, it became increasingly evident that there were more questions than answers. The discovery of their truck, abandoned and covered in dirt at a local hardware store, only deepened the mystery. Despite the search efforts, it was clear that someone had gone to great lengths to erase any trace of the couple. The initial confusion over what had happened to John and Shelley Markley gave way to a sense of growing urgency. Their disappearance was not a simple case of a couple choosing to leave, nor was it a spontaneous decision made in the heat of an emotional moment. The clues began to suggest that there was far more to this case than initially thought, something that would require careful investigation and patience to unravel. The search intensifies. Over the following days, investigators scoured the areas surrounding the Markley home, as well as any potential locations where the couple might have been. The search expanded beyond their immediate neighborhood, with officers checking nearby forests, abandoned buildings, and remote areas. Despite their efforts, no new evidence emerged, and the frustration among investigators continued to mount. Authorities began to look into the couple's financial situation, hoping to find any motive or lead that could explain why they might have disappeared. While the Markleys had been through some tough times, including the devastating house fire in 1993 and the recent deaths of family members, there was no obvious financial strain that could explain their sudden disappearance. In fact, John had recently sold several of his firearms to help support his family, and Shelley had been carefully preparing for the winter months, filling their freezer with food, actions that seemed inconsistent with the idea of them fleeing without notice. A new lead, the man in the truck. As investigators pieced together the details of the morning of December 15, 1995, one key question began to dominate the investigation. Who was the mysterious third person seen in the Markleys' truck earlier that morning? The bank teller who had interacted with John and Shelley reported seeing 3 people in the Chevy pickup truck: John in the driver's seat, Shelley sitting beside him, and another man in the back seat, whose identity was unknown. This mysterious man became a focal point for investigators. Who was he, and what role did he play in the disappearance of the Markleys? Was he a friend, an acquaintance, or someone entirely unrelated to the family? The police began to dig into John and Shelley's past, hoping to identify this figure and determine whether he had any connection to their lives. The people in their lives. John Markley had always been a well-liked and respected member of his community. Described as friendly, hard-working, and fiercely loyal to his family, he was not the kind of person who would suddenly disappear without a trace. His relationship with his twin sister, Bonnie, was particularly close, and it was unimaginable that he would miss her funeral for any reason. This only heightened the concern that something was wrong. People who knew John were confident that he would never abandon his family, especially during such a difficult time. Shelley, too, was a devoted mother and wife. Described as kind-hearted and warm, she had a deep sense of loyalty to her family and friends. No one who knew her could believe that she would walk away from her children or her life with John. It was clear to everyone who knew the couple that they had been inseparable and that their bond was strong. The possibility that they had decided to leave of their own accord seemed more and more unlikely as time went on. Investigators began to look into their relationships with friends, neighbors, and co-workers. They spoke to family members, including John's mother, Ruth, who confirmed that John had been dealing with the emotional toll of losing his father and a nephew, but there was no indication that he was considering running away with Shelley. Furthermore, there was no sign of any serious conflict between John and Shelley that would have caused them to leave abruptly. The twisted web of possibilities. As the investigation deepened, one theory emerged that involved an old friend of John's, someone who had recently become a rival. This person, whose identity was initially kept confidential, had been known to have had a complicated relationship with John. While they had been close in the past, something had changed between them, and their friendship had soured. Could this man have played a role in John and Shelley's disappearance? Was he seeking revenge or involved in something far more sinister? As investigators dug into this theory, they began to uncover unsettling information that hinted at a deeper, darker plot. It was soon revealed that the man in question had a history of criminal activity and a motive that seemed to involve more than just bad blood. According to some reports, the man had been in contact with John around the time of the disappearance, though the nature of their interactions remained unclear. Was this a coincidence, or did it suggest something more? The idea that an old friend turned enemy might have been involved in their disappearance became a central focus for investigators. At the same time, the possibility that John and Shelley had been involved in something more serious, something that involved a criminal element, could not be ruled out. Had they been unknowingly involved in a larger scheme, and was this why they had disappeared without a trace? Theories and setbacks. As the investigation unfolded, theories began to mount. Some believed that the couple had been targeted by someone they knew, perhaps a former friend or a business associate with whom they had crossed paths. Others speculated that they had become victims of a random crime, abducted by someone looking to take advantage of the couple's vulnerability. With so many unanswered questions, it seemed as though the investigation would be bogged down by conflicting theories and a lack of concrete evidence. Despite the setbacks, law enforcement continued to pursue every lead, no matter how small. They worked tirelessly, following up on every potential clue, hoping that something would finally break the case wide open. The search for John and Shelley Markley became a consuming effort, not just for the authorities, but for their family, friends, and the community that had known and loved them. With each passing day, the mystery deepened. The case of the Markleys' disappearance was not just a missing persons case. It was a puzzle that seemed to grow more complex with each new piece. And as investigators continued to search for the truth, the shadow of uncertainty loomed larger, with no clear resolution in sight. As the investigation into the disappearance of John and Shelley Markley continued to unfold, the case seemed to grow more complex with each passing day. Theories, false leads, and frustration mounted as the family and law enforcement tried to piece together the puzzle. The Markleys' disappearance had turned into a full-fledged mystery that no one seemed able to solve. The discovery of a key lead. In the weeks following their disappearance, the investigation started to lead in a new direction. Despite the best efforts of investigators, they had little more than circumstantial evidence and witness testimony to go on. The most promising lead came from the discovery of a critical piece of evidence, one that would change the course of the investigation. As the authorities continued to sift through the details, they discovered that an old associate of John Markleys had been spotted near the area in the days leading up to the disappearance. This individual, who had a questionable reputation, was someone who had been close to John in the past, but had recently become more distant. What made this lead especially significant was the fact that this person was seen near John's home on the morning of December 15, 1995, the same morning the Markleys were last seen. The person, whose identity was not initially revealed, became the subject of intense scrutiny. What was his connection to the Markleys, and why had he been in the area? Was there a deeper, darker motive behind his presence? The more investigators learned, the more it seemed like this individual had played some role in the couple's sudden disappearance. The connection to the Chevrolet truck. Another significant lead came in the form of the Chevrolet pickup truck that had been abandoned in the parking lot of a local hardware store, as previously mentioned. When the truck was first discovered, it appeared to have been driven through rough terrain, covered in dirt, and left in an area that had no direct connection to the Markleys' daily routine. The condition of the vehicle raised several questions. Why had it been driven in this way? Who had driven it? And most importantly, where had John and Shelley gone after leaving their home? Investigators began to piece together the timeline of events. They learned that the truck had been seen at the hardware store on the day of the disappearance, but no one could recall seeing who had driven it. Witnesses did not recall any suspicious activity around the truck, but the presence of the vehicle so far from the Markleys' home was unsettling. The investigators' initial theory was that the truck had been deliberately abandoned to throw them off the trail, but the absence of any valuable evidence inside the vehicle only made matters more confusing. One of the most puzzling discoveries during the investigation was the missing keys. Despite finding the truck, the keys to the vehicle were nowhere to be found. There was no sign of forced entry, and the vehicle appeared to be undisturbed aside from the dirt covering it. The lack of keys added another layer of mystery to the case. Why would John and Shelley leave the truck in a random parking lot, seemingly in perfect condition, but without the keys? The discovery of the truck and its eerie condition raised more questions than answers, but it provided a crucial lead that kept the investigation moving forward. The role of the mysterious man. With the discovery of the truck came the question of who the mysterious man in the back seat of the Chevy pickup truck was. The bank teller had reported seeing 3 people in the truck earlier that morning: John in the driver's seat, Shelley sitting beside him, and an unidentified man in the back. The presence of this third person became the key to unlocking the mystery of what had happened to the Markleys. Investigators began to look into this individual, who had not been seen or heard from before. They questioned people who knew John and Shelley, trying to determine whether this person had any connection to them. Was he a friend, an acquaintance, or someone with a more sinister agenda? The search for the man in the truck became the focal point of the investigation. As time passed, it became apparent that he was not just a bystander. He was likely involved in some way in the events leading up to the Markleys' disappearance. One of the most difficult aspects of this part of the investigation was that no one seemed to know who the man was or where he came from. No one had seen him in the town before, and there was no information to suggest that he was connected to John or Shelley in any meaningful way. The mystery deepened as investigators tried to determine whether he was a stranger to the Markleys or someone with a hidden motive. The community's role in the investigation. As the investigation progressed, the community in and around Bloomfield, Ohio, began to take a more active role in helping law enforcement. Friends, family, and neighbors rallied together, hoping to find the answers that had eluded the authorities for so long. The disappearance of John and Shelley Markley had rocked the small town, and people were desperate to know what had happened to the couple who had been so deeply embedded in the community. The Markleys' children, still young and traumatized by the loss of their parents, were a constant reminder of the stakes in the investigation. The couple's 5 children were now without their parents, and the impact of the disappearance weighed heavily on the community. Their pain, as well as the uncertainty surrounding their parents' whereabouts, pushed everyone involved in the case to work harder, to follow every lead, and to hope for a breakthrough. While the investigation was ongoing, many in the community wondered if John and Shelley had simply decided to leave, as some had suggested. But those who knew them best, family, friends, and co-workers, could not believe that the couple would abandon their children, their home, and their life in such a way. The idea that they had chosen to disappear voluntarily seemed too far-fetched. The presence of the mysterious man and the strange circumstances surrounding their last known moments only confirmed the worst fears of those who cared about the Markleys. Theories and false leads. As the case stretched into its second month without any new leads, theories began to pile up. Some people speculated that the Markleys had been kidnapped, while others suggested that they had met with foul play. There were even rumors that they had been involved in some sort of criminal activity, though no evidence had surfaced to support such claims. Despite these rumors, law enforcement remained focused on the facts. They knew that there was more to the case than met the eye, but they couldn't yet pinpoint exactly what had happened to John and Shelley. Every possible lead was followed, but each new theory seemed to bring more questions than answers. The case of John and Shelley Markley's disappearance would continue to haunt their family, the small town of Bloomfield, and the investigators who worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. Even as time passed and the case grew colder, the search for answers never stopped. Everyone involved in the investigation hoped that one day the truth would be revealed, that they would finally uncover what happened to the Markleys and bring closure to a mystery that had consumed their lives for far too long. As the months passed and the search for John and Shelley Markley stretched into its third year, the case had begun to fade from the public spotlight, though the pain and uncertainty never fully left the Markley family and the small town of Bloomfield, Ohio. What had started as a routine investigation into a mysterious disappearance had evolved into a frustrating and perplexing puzzle with no clear answers. Despite the tireless efforts of law enforcement, the chilling truth about what had happened to John and Shelley remained elusive, and many began to wonder if the case would ever be solved. New evidence, new hope. Then, in the summer of 1998, a breakthrough came that would breathe new life into the investigation. A piece of evidence that had previously been overlooked suddenly surfaced, providing investigators with the clue they had desperately been seeking. This new lead would force them to re-examine everything they thought they knew about the Markleys' disappearance. The discovery came when a local resident contacted the police after noticing something strange while walking near the woods not far from the Markleys' home. The resident had stumbled upon a weathered, partially buried object in the dense underbrush. Upon further inspection, it turned out to be a piece of personal property that belonged to John Markley. This unexpected find, the kind of evidence that investigators had hoped for, was a critical step toward uncovering the truth. The item in question was a small personal belonging, a part of the truck's interior that had likely fallen out or been discarded in a hurry. It was quickly identified as John's. While it wasn't enough to reveal the full story behind their disappearance, it signaled to investigators that they were getting closer to uncovering what had happened and possibly finding the Markleys. A change in direction, the unthinkable discovery. While this new piece of evidence brought hope, it also pointed the investigation in a terrifying direction. After the discovery, investigators began to focus their attention on a previously unexplored area near the woods. What they found there would forever alter the trajectory of the case. The woods just miles from the Markleys' home had been scoured many times before, but now they seemed to hold an eerie secret. On a rainy afternoon in August of 1998, a search team revisited the area once again, and this time they made an unsettling discovery: a shallow grave. It was in a secluded part of the woods, hidden from view by overgrown trees and thick brush. Inside the grave, investigators found skeletal remains that, after forensic examination, were confirmed to belong to none other than John and Shelley Markley. The confirmation sent shockwaves through the community. The two people who had vanished so suddenly and inexplicably 3 years earlier were finally found. The news broke quickly, and a mixture of disbelief, relief, and sorrow rippled through the town. Finally, after years of searching, the Markleys had been found. But what had happened to them? Why had they been left to die in such a remote location? And who could have done this to them? The investigation takes a darker turn. With the remains of John and Shelley finally recovered, the investigation now shifted to uncovering the truth behind their deaths. What had started as a search for missing persons now turned into a full-fledged homicide investigation. Detectives began to look more closely at the people who had been in John's life, the ones who may have been capable of such a heinous crime. The key question remained: who was responsible for their deaths, and why had they been killed? A chilling realization began to form in the minds of investigators. The couple's deaths might not have been random. In fact, they might have been the result of something far more personal, something that had been brewing for years. One of the first leads that law enforcement turned to was the mysterious man who had been seen in the truck with John and Shelley on the morning of their disappearance. The man, who had remained unnamed for all these years, had been someone from John's past, a former associate who had fallen out of touch. He was known to have had some financial dealings with John, but the exact nature of their relationship remained unclear. Could this man have been involved in the deaths of John and Shelley Markley? Or was he just an innocent bystander in a tragic chain of events? As investigators dug deeper into the background of the man in the truck, they uncovered a disturbing history. The man had a criminal record and had been involved in shady business dealings in the past. Some of those dealings had been with John, but it seemed that their relationship had soured in the years leading up to the disappearance. Financial disputes, jealousy, and unresolved conflicts had simmered beneath the surface for years, and now it seemed that the consequences of those tensions had finally come to a head. The arrest and trial. In the fall of 1998, the investigation took another major turn. After weeks of intense questioning and interviews with key witnesses, law enforcement made a shocking arrest. The man who had been in the truck with John and Shelley on the morning of their disappearance was taken into custody. His name was revealed to be Bradley Tanner, and his connection to the Markleys was more sinister than anyone had ever imagined. Tanner was charged with 2 counts of murder, one for John Markley and one for Shelley Markley. The details of the crime were horrifying. Tanner had been involved in a violent altercation with John Markley over a business dispute. When John tried to cut ties with Tanner, the latter became enraged. The tension between the two had reached a boiling point, and Tanner saw no way out except through violence. In a brutal and senseless act, Tanner had murdered John and Shelley, then left their bodies in the woods to be discovered years later. The trial that followed was a spectacle. It captivated the community and made headlines across the country. Tanner's defense team tried to argue that the killings had been an accident, a spur-of-the-moment decision driven by anger and alcohol. But the prosecution painted a much darker picture, one of premeditated murder and calculated cruelty. In the end, the jury convicted Bradley Tanner of 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Closure, but at what cost? For the Markley family, the conviction of Bradley Tanner brought some measure of closure, but it didn't erase the pain of their loss. The death of John and Shelley had left an indelible scar on their children, who had grown up without their parents. While the trial brought justice, it could never fully repair the damage done to the family. In the years since, the town of Bloomfield has slowly moved on, but the memory of the Markley family's disappearance and tragic end continues to linger in the minds of those who knew them. The case, once one of Ohio's greatest mysteries, has become a somber reminder of the dark side of human nature, how trust can be shattered and lives destroyed by greed and resentment. Though justice was served, it remains clear that the Markley family will never be the same. And the story of John and Shelley Markley, a couple who loved their family and community, serves as a tragic warning of how easily a seemingly ordinary life can be upended by the actions of a single violent individual.